What is up, everybody? The day has finally come where I have taken the deep dive and have decided to play Shadow the Hedgehog in cEDH. This is my story. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Today's episode, we are breaking down the Shadow the Hedgehog deck that I brought to the finals of a local cEDH tournament. And yeah, we're going to talk about how I brought a Hedgehog to cEDH. We're going to talk about the deck, all the little intricacies of this deck, and why it even kind of works. Shadow the Hedgehog for black, red. This is a 4/2 with haste. When it or another creature you control with flash or haste dies, you get to draw a card. And then it says each spell you cast has split second if a mana from an artifact was spent to cast it. And in parentheses, it defines that split second, which I think will be important for the sake of this video. As long as it is on the stack, players cannot cast spells or activate abilities that are not mana abilities. Meaning, if you use artifact mana with your commander out, nobody gets to do anything about it. Now, you will still have things like Rhystic Study triggers and things like that, but there will not be any activated abilities or spells being put on the stack on top of those things, which gets pretty crazy. So how do we best utilize Shadow the Hedgehog, right? So I think from the very beginning of this commander being talked about, being spoiled, etc., I think there was sort of this notion that Shadow is a fix-all, right? Shadow is just like, it's supposed to be this broken thing in the command zone that you can get down super early and then just win the game, right? But to be honest, that's a pretty unrealistic goal, in my opinion. I think Shadow's casting cost alone restricts it to being somewhat of a fair card, right? Meaning that you have to do a decent amount of building around this commander, right? Not just having things like, you know, for example, your talismans and your soul rings, etc., right? But having an abundance of artifact mana so that if you are trying to utilize Shadow's ability, you are able to break parity on those things and you're able to do some pretty busted stuff with your commander. Not to mention doing some busted stuff while also having at one point to have played black, red for this commander, right? Which is not an easy task, right? You're not getting that off a Soul Ring. You're not getting it off a Mana Vault or a Grim Monolith, right? It has to be pip specific, which leads us even further down the treasure specific plan, right? So that being said, it sort of puts this deck in a really weird space, right? Because it's not exactly a turbo deck. Now, don't get me wrong. There are going to be moments when you play this deck where you can lean towards a more proactive strategy. For example, there was a round I played the other day where I went to go put a turn 2 Bolus of Citadel into play. It is a possibility of this deck. Now, the other side of it is the fact that Shadow is actually something that gives you a mid to late game, right? Traditionally with Rakdos, a lot of your commanders enable some sort of fast Rakdos strategy, but realistically, you actually don't need a lot in the command zone to make Rakdos as a color pie work. What Shadow gives you, though, is late game. Rakdos is really good at exploding out of the gates, right? I have described this deck when I was playing it this weekend to some of the people who were at the event as it's like playing a Canadian Highlander Rakdos deck until the late game, and that's where Shadow comes in, right? But that card advantage side, meaning it's not actually that relevant when it or another creature with flash or haste dies, draw a card, that doesn't come up all that often, right? You may occasionally sack your commander or a spare Bowmasters, but realistically, that's not what's happening in this deck very often. What's happening in this deck is that you are playing a solid Rakdos mid-range / turbo game plan that is supported and enabled by Shadow. Now, one thing that, in my opinion, is pivotal to this deck is those treasure makers that I was talking about, right? And I am on basically all of them. We are on Magda in the 99, right? We're on Professional Facebreaker, Grim Hireling, Knuckles the Echidna, Rev, Tithe Extractor, right? Anything that says, hey, moving to combat, attacking your opponents, dealing combat damage, making a bunch of treasures, all of those effects are in this deck. Now, don't get me wrong, you can go even deeper and deeper into some really weird, obscure versions, right? But the point is, I really wanted that pile of cards in this deck in particular. Now, what's nice about Magda is not only is this a treasure enabler, but in these colors, it's also known for using its activated ability to either cheat in a large artifact or a large dragon, right? Which, fun fact, is relevant to this game plan. I also just did not see Magda over the course of this tournament whatsoever, which was a bit of a shame, but that's okay. That's, for a later day, I guess. But we have two main targets that we could cheat in. Now, I debated about whether playing the Hoarding Broodlord package in this deck at all. The first thing that was in there, however, was the Bolas of Citadel, right? First of all, anyone who knows me knows I love Bolas of Citadel. It's a pet card of mine. It's a card I love quite a lot, but I also think there's a reason for that, and it's because it actually does good stuff. This is a very good Bolas of Citadel deck. Now, that being said, during the course of the tournament, I did get 2 lands in a row multiple times, and that happens, right? Like, Bolas of Citadel does have very real downside. That being said, it still won me a number of games as well, right? So either cheating it into the battlefield through Magda, the other ways that I sort of alluded to earlier were the classic Goblin Welder package, right? Where you are putting it into the graveyard with some sort of entomb effect and then bring it back with either Goblin Welder, or I was also playing Daredee Scrap Savant for that exact reason, for that middle ability, which is -2, sacrifice an artifact if you do return target artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield. And this is often compared to a card like Trash for Treasure, which is basically that effect on a sorcery for 1 less mana. But Daredee also has the upside of, like, if your hand's bad, you can start rummaging through cards and things like that if you're, if it gets to stick around at all. So that's why Daredee made the final cut in the deck. But that one I drew at one point, but it was when I already had a Bolas of Citadel already on the battlefield, I think, so it didn't really come up a whole bunch. However, opening turn 1 Goblin Welder and threatening a turn 2 Entomb definitely came up over the course of this tournament as well, which was pretty sweet. So with Bolas of Citadel, how are we actually winning the game? Obviously, you're able to play a bunch of stuff for life off the top of your library. And I guess let me read this card for those who haven't seen it before. Bolas of Citadel is 3 and black, black, black. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. And if you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its mana value rather than its casting cost. It also has tap, sack 10 non-land permanents. Each opponent loses 10 life, which I literally don't know that I've ever done. But that is a line of text there. So with Bolas of Citadel, your main win condition in this deck is going to be Aetherflux Reservoir, right? Now, traditionally speaking, you consider Sensei's Divining Top, Aetherflux, and Citadel sort of a 3-card combo in that sense. There was also many times that I just used Reservoir as a payoff for my Breach lines as well. To be honest, I don't know that I would play a version of this deck without Reservoir, because it just ends up being a really clean win for almost each and every one of your ways to gain a bunch of advantage in this deck. I very often found myself in the middle of a Breach line entombing my Aetherflux by being several steps into a grinding station line, playing it, now 3 spells later, I'm at 80 life and shooting opponents down, right? So Aetherflux came in quite handy. But for those who don't know, with Sensei's Divining Top and Bolas of Citadel, you're able to basically pay 1 life, put the top on top of your library, and then recast the top. So even if the top of your library is, for example, a bunch of lands in a row that you can't clear off of Citadel, Sensei's Top allows you to go there, and it basically allows you to say, hey, every 1 life, if I don't want to be casting the spells off the top for free, is at least a card that I can put into my hand to gain a bunch of value later on. So it's a very hard combo to break through when that gets going. And then obviously, if you have Sensei's Top and Aetherflux, you're then, instead of losing life every time you're drawing cards, you're losing 1 life, but then you're gaining life equal to the spells you've cast that turn, which gets pretty outlandish pretty quickly. I did mention Hoarding Broodlord earlier. What is that card doing in here? So Hoarding Broodlord is a reanimator target. As you may notice, I have things like Reanimate. I have Animate Dead and Necromancy in the enchantment slot. Oh, I guess I actually cut Animate Dead. I definitely did that the day before the tournament, and I totally forgot until right now. But yeah, okay, so I have two Reanimate effects. That's right, because I found literally the night beforehand I was drawing 2 of the Reanimate effects in too many of my hands, and I said this deck couldn't afford more dead cards, so that's why I'm only on Necromancy and Reanimate. That's it. Yes, so I'm on those 2 Reanimate effects, plus obviously we can once again cheat it in to play with Magda, or honestly with the amount of treasure production in this deck, there is very realistically a world where I can hardcast a Hoarding Broodlord very often in this archetype. But all that being said, Broodlord allows you to go search for a card and put it into exile, and that spell from exile has Convoke. And with this deck, you can do the classic Hoarding Broodlord line, which is to go and acquire a Saw in Half that you'll see here in the instance. That'll make you 2 Broodlords, and usually you can assemble some sort of way to win the game. Now, there's a number of different outlets that are sort of your best outlets for the Saw in Half line, and it really depends on your board state, what you're dealing with. The simplest one is to get Burnt Offering, sacrifice one of your dragons for 8 mana, and then just target yourself with a Peer into the Abyss. drawing half your library is usually a pretty good way to win the game. It's usually a pretty effective tool, as some might say. But in other circumstances, I've seen people also just go Burnt Offering into an Underworld Breach, for example. There's plenty of different ways that you can make it work, and it really just depends on what you're trying to work with at the time. Are you like Shadow and you want to collect all of the Chaos Emeralds? Well, they're probably in stock at Tales of Adventure Magic. ToaMagic.com has such a crazy inventory of singles. They have amazing things from reserved list to amazing foils to just like one of the largest collections of any store that I've ever seen. And if you use code Comedian checkout, you can get 5% off your order. Toa Magic has been absolutely killing it with card games. I hear nothing but amazing things about folks who go from this channel and go over and actually use the Toa store. And y'all keep killing it month after month, and Toa's super happy with it. So yeah, I think it's just one of those things where it keeps working for a very good reason. ToaMagic.com. They have insanely quick shipping. You can order things online and pick them up at events where Toa Magic booths are at. It is an amazing service. They have insanely fast shipping, a crazy wide inventory. Check out ToaMagic.com and use code Comedian to get percentage off your order. Now, notably, if we're going to talk about backup win conditions, we'll talk about Breach in a second. But apart from Aetherflux Reservoir, we are on Dualcaster Mage. Now, it is worth noting here that first of all, for those who don't know, Dualcaster Mage with either Saw in Half or Twin Flame. With Twin Flame, you make a bunch of infinite hasty bodies. With Saw in Half, you can make infinite copies of 1/1 Dualcaster Mages that can also copy a spell that's already on the stack infinitely as well, in general. Or you can also, I'm pretty sure you can also Saw in Half Bowmasters infinitely. I just have to do the math in my head, but I'm 99% sure it can do that as well. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can Saw in Half Bowmasters infinitely as well if that's on the battlefield somewhere. Well, if you have one specifically. But all that being said, it is worth noting that because the way priority works, you have to make sure that your Saw in Half or your Twin Flame are not uncounterable or not granted split second by Shadow, right? Because if they have split second, you also cannot put spells on the stack, right? So for example, if you go to cast Twin Flame, but it has split second, you have nowhere in the priority order can you play your Dualcaster to copy it, right? So specifically that combo is a little bit fragile to those types of interactions, right? You can put a Twin Flame on the stack, but you have to let it be vulnerable to counter spells, basically, which is a big window for you. And honestly, Dualcaster, in my opinion, is probably never going to be used in this deck if you're playing the deck correctly. It is just in there as a backup in case your opponents look at you and go, okay, how are you winning? It's a very easy thing to go like, oh, I'll just go get a Dualcaster and then win with infinite beats. To be honest, you don't need it. But there's enough random weird corner cases where I'm like, I guess it's worth having. Like, at worst case scenario, it's a bad counter spell, which I'm okay with. And Twin Flame isn't fantastic, but it can do some things. It's also worth noting that Twin Flame plus Pinnacle Monk can do some sort of funky stuff in the deck as well. But that's like very, very complicated, funky stuff. So it's not really being included for that reason in particular. But all that being said, Twin Flame's at least somewhat decent, and Saw in Half was already in the deck for the Broodlord lines anyways. So at the end of the day, like Dualcaster is like not a super offensive combo to be playing for the deck, right? It kind of gets the job done. I mentioned Breach a couple times. So let's talk about the Breach lines here. There are two Breach lines in the deck. One is Grinding Station plus any artifact that at least costs as much as it makes, right? So any 0 that doesn't make any mana, or any 1 that makes 2 mana, or any 1 that makes 3 mana, right? Anything as long as it is not costing more to play it than it is that's at least making net even, right? So even if it's a Lion's Eye Diamond and you're not cracking the Lion's Eye Diamond, you're just sacrificing it to Grinding Station, you're still fine to go through the loop. And the Grinding Station loop basically allows you to sculpt your graveyard, right? You're not really going up in cards in the graveyard, unless obviously there's a few like random side cases, but realistically you're mostly just sculpting the cards that are in your graveyard. And what's nice about this deck, because we're in Aetherflux, like you can always just use a Mana Vault or a Soul Ring or a Grim Monolith, whatever, to just make your mana and sculpt down to your graveyard until you have enough to play Aetherflux Reservoir, play 1 or 2 spells out of the graveyard, and then just boom, cannon everybody to death. Right? It's a pretty easy line to get down to at the end of the day. You can also grind down to a Praetor's Grasp, and if you've made enough mana, you can go black, blue, or black, colorless blue, take someone's Thassa's Oracle too, right? This is your other like backup win condition, but I don't love relying on Praetor's Grasp, which is why the Dualcaster is in there as well. And then hypothetically, you can also grind down to get the Dualcaster as well, right? The other graveyard line in here is with Stitcher's Supplier, right? When it enters or dies, you mill 3, and Culling the Weak, which says you can pay a black to sacrifice a creature and add 4 black. This is another line that doesn't add cards to your graveyard, but it sculpts cards in your graveyard. And funny enough, this line also is really interesting because it goes up 3 cards, down 3 cards, you exile 3 cards, right? But you also net 2 black mana every time, because the only 2 spells you're casting are the Culling the Weak and the Stitchers, which is only equivalent for 2 black pips, whereas Culling the Weak actually makes you 4 black pips as you're going through. So that's a line where you can actually make a lot of mana really, really quickly, also as you're going through it. And funny enough, it also, for example, if you need to sculpt your graveyard, but you want to pay for a Rhystic Study, the 2 extra mana allows you to pay for a Rhystic Study as you're executing this Underworld Breach line, which is pretty interesting to think about. Is it a perfect line? No, absolutely not. But those are 2 cards I'd probably play anyways, so it kind of works out, especially Culling the Weak, obviously. Stitchers is at least a little bit more, there for sacrifice fodder, etc. That's also why you see things like Greedy Freebooter and Impulsive Pilfer in the deck. Not only do they die and make treasures, which obviously treasures is very good for this deck, but they're there mostly for your Culling the Weaks, your Diabolic Intents with Impulsive Pilfer and a bunch of the other red creatures. They also sacrifice to your Flare of Duplication, right? Mostly black requires a lot of these sort of value sacrifices throughout its game plan, and so like it's a pretty easy way to just have bodies there to do that. Now it does suck a little bit when you're playing a deck like this because Shadow gives you no real card advantage in the command zone, right? So there is a certain phobia that folks can have about like, hey, like there's only so many dead cards, right? And any cards that aren't doing what our game plan is doing in the deck, but it still ends up being pretty okay at the end of the day. I also am going to go over, so we talked about the Peer into the Abyss Hoarding Broodlord line, but we should also talk about the Pinnacle Monk Hoarding Broodlord line, which I do think is a very relevant line to go over. So for those who are here, what you can see is, all right, so for example, we have our Hoarding Broodlord, right? Here on our battlefield. We do the classic, right? You go get your saw in half, and you saw in half your Broodlord, right? Boom. These both go to the graveyard right now. And then you go get your 2 copies. Okay, so these are my 2 Broodlords. Now, copy 1 goes and gets that Burnt Offering, like we talked about, and puts that face down in exile. And copy 2 goes and grabs Pinnacle Monk. Now, Pinnacle Monk can be played as one of your lands. Once again, you can just like turn this into a Peer into the Abyss, but if you want a like even more solidly, basically if you're not worried about going through a Rhystic Study and you want to make infinite red and black and get more tutors from your line that don't just fold to a single Peer into the Abyss, this is the best way to go about it, right? So with our 2 Broodlords, we get Burnt Offering and Pinnacle Monk, right? We convoke one of them to the Burnt Offering, which allows us to make a bunch of red and black mana, and that Burnt Offering goes to our graveyard, right? So at this point, we use some of that red and black mana to play our Pinnacle Monk. You can probably convoke the Broodlord too, just for the heck of it, right? And this Pinnacle Monk will now go and grab the Saw in Half in the graveyard, right? What's nice here is that we have only used 5 of the mana that we had available, and because we convoked here, we still have 4 mana left over, right? Which is perfectly enough to allow us to now saw in half the Pinnacle Monk, right? Allowing that to go to the graveyard. And now we have 2 copies of Pinnacle Monk, right? Which we'll show with these construct tokens, right? So now we have 2 Pinnacle Monks, and those 2 Pinnacle Monks will pick up your saw in half, and they will pick up your Burnt Offering, right? What's going to happen is you're going to Burnt Offering 1 Pinnacle Monk, making you 5 mana. You're going to saw in half the other, making using 3 of that 5 mana, right? And what's basically going to happen is that you're going to make infinite Pinnacle Monks because this whole process only costs 4, right? And you're going to be making 5 every single time. So you actually get to make infinite black and red mana. You also have infinite cut in half Pinnacle Monks as you're going through the process. So effectively infinite 1/1s, right? And you can also end that process by still having 2 enter the battlefields, right? So you've made infinite black and red mana. You also hypothetically can pick up any instant and sorcery in your graveyard if you don't want to pick these 2 back up, right? And then at that point, you can still pick up this saw in half, once again, with infinite black and red mana, and you can saw in half this Broodlord that's been sitting here the whole time, this Broodlord copy, right? And so now with infinite black and red mana, you can go and get 2 tutors with infinite black and red mana, right? And at that point, very easy to hopefully string a win together with infinite black and red mana and 2 tutors. Kind of out of nowhere, right? And that's not to mention the fact that once again, these Pinnacle Monks pick up 2 spells out of the graveyard, right? So, yeah, at that point, it gets pretty simple. And usually you can either grab like an Underworld Breach, play your Aetherflux Reservoir, play the spells out of the graveyard, gain infinite life. You can do the Peer into the Abyss thing, which that works perfectly fine. You can go get like, I don't know, like Citadel and Sensei's Top, sure, if you need to, right? Like there's plenty of payoffs. It doesn't really particularly matter too much which individual payoff you end up going and grabbing, but that is sort of the idea. You'll have infinite black and red mana, and you can go get 2 tutors worth of stuff, which should win you the game. Plus, you have infinite 1/1 bodies, so also a pretty nice way to figure out how to end it. We gotta shout out the channel partner Heavy Play. Heavy Play makes amazing products, and I love partnering with this program because I have loved Heavy Play products long before I was working with them professionally. Heavy Play makes amazing, solid products. These Heavy Play products are awesome. They have their playmats. They have super sweet sleeves. I've been talking to a lot of folks at events lately who have been super impressed by the fact that the Heavy Play sleeves kind of fixed everything that was originally plaguing them. And they have, in my opinion, one of the best shuffle feels of any sleeve, period, with the curved bottoms. It's awesome. The Heavy Play deck boxes, the dice trays, the playmats, all of it is super convenient. And if you are playing cEDH in any sort of long-term capacity, and if you want to protect your decks that have, a lot of people have real cards, real cEDH cards, and you want the best place to store all of your cEDH products, and not only the best place to store them from a protection standpoint, but also from a standpoint of, these are super convenient products to use when you're at events, right? Like there's so many people who have these giant deck boxes that splay all over the place and have all of these random compartments and things like that. Heavy Play is a smooth, streamlined process. It locks magnetically into place, so you're not knocking your deck box over in the middle of the tournament. It is just a convenient, nice system. So check out heavyplay.com. You can get 10% off your order when you use code comedian at checkout. So it is worth mentioning that this deck is what I would consider a semi-parasitic proactive deck, right? As I mentioned, you can have early games where you go for those early wins, right? But you're not going to be jamming in a way that is basically like, if I don't jam on turn 2, I just lose the game, right? Because of your treasure enablers, you can actually grind decently well. You're not like fighting super crazy on the stack versus a bunch of crazy counterspells or anything, right? But you also don't have to necessarily like just jam because your deck gets way worse over time. Because you can, for example, I had a game several times when I played Rev, right? And was able to connect in with like, there was one game where I had Ragavan, Grim Hireling, and Rev all going into combat at one point, and just basically making like 7 treasures per combat, right? And getting card advantage from Rev, hitting all my opponents, getting the top card of their library in exile, hitting them with Ragavan, getting top card of their library with exile. Plus, you're on what I consider like fair Necropotence in this deck, right? Necro is in the deck to not necessarily like just win you the game, right? But this is the I'm going to have 7 cards at the end of every turn type of Necropotence in this deck. So that gives you a certain level of card advantage. You have the 1 ring in the deck to do that exact same thing. Not to mention you've got obviously these big payoffs like Citadel and Pier and things like that, right? So it genuinely doesn't feel a whole lot like you're out of the game when it comes to these mid-range games. It's just basically the idea that you're not like removing a ton of things, you're not countering a ton of spells, but you are keeping up the advantage game if the windows of opportunity aren't quite there. I think the kind of nightmare pod for this deck is if you're playing against a bunch of interactive decks that then decide to very quickly go greedy all of a sudden. That was basically my only 2 losses were in that type of environment where I was playing against, it was the same exact players, same exact pod, funny enough. But it was basically like, there's a Magda and 2 blue farms, right? And every time the blue farms decided to fight each other on the stack and then one of them jammed the win over the top of the other, that was usually when we didn't have those games. But basically every other game I played during the weekend where I was playing against other real meta decks like Kinnan and Blue Farm and things like that, in those more crunchy mid-range pods, that's actually where the deck starts to thrive, right? Like, don't get me wrong, you can get your cheesy early, like turn 2 bolts to Citadel wins, but like, I don't think the deck actually does that as much as it might look like it does through the construction. What actually ends up happening much more often is that there's a lot of back and forth with like this deck tries to go off and then that drains the resources from the table. And this deck tries to go off and that drains the resources from the table. And you're playing some of your treasure enablers and you're connecting in and you're gaining resources, right? But you're not like necessarily pushing too hard to overextend and get blown out yourself, especially once again, going into a bunch of these mid-range pods, right? And at some point, you can just sort of sneak a shadow in. And yeah, people will talk about it, right? But there's, especially in a game where everyone's resources are being taxed really heavily, right? There's only so much they can do to hit one creature. And then by the time Shadow's in there and Shadow sticks, you can start to do some pretty crazy stuff with a bunch of uncounterable spells, right? And being able to then, for example, I had a game this weekend where I was able to win into 2 Rhystic Studies because I basically was able to go play Shadow, uncounterable gamble to go get an Underworld Breach. Or actually, sorry, it was uncounterable gamble. Yeah, to go get an Underworld Breach. Uncounterable Underworld Breach to play an uncounterable gamble to go get a defense grid to then play an uncounterable defense grid all within the same turn. Which was obviously awesome when that was able to work like that, right? Obviously, there are ways that falls apart in many different circumstances, right? But that's the time in which Shadow shines, right? Is like when everyone's been doing crazy resource battles, mid-range things, and then you can just get an opportunity to just basically say, like, if Shadow sticks at this point, I'm able to go, you can't deal with this, 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 good game, right? And it's not that necessarily, like, for example, like a lot of the wins that you saw there, right? You don't have 100 treasures to pay for an entire grinding station Underworld Breach line, right? There are points in which you have to put an artifact on the stack, especially if you're using the 0 mana breach lines. Funny enough, the soul rings, the mana vaults, those are actually better combo outlets in this deck, funny enough, because they are requiring mana to be played. So therefore you can tap your artifact to sack it to grinding station to replay it with your artifact, right? So that's actually a way that those lines actually become less interactable, right? Point being that it's not that your entire line needs to be uncounterable, right? When you're going for a win, it's more so about sticking the right spells with that uncounterability and making sure you're paying attention to those things, right? Because like even looking at a card like Beseech the Mirror, right? That's a card that seems amazing in this deck all of a sudden, right? But then thinking about the fact that if you cast that spell off of Bargain, all of a sudden that spell has been cast from Bargain and not with treasure mana, right? So like that's a spell that becomes vulnerable, right? So then does Beseech become a 4 mana demonic tutor? Doesn't mean it has to be in that way, right? But and once again, it has a very much a faster implication to it if you're trying to win before Shadow even comes out, right? But it's one of those cards that all of a sudden is like, oh wait, I have to think about the Shadow tax on all of these things, right? And how I can best utilize my commander in that way, right? The deck is far from simplistic in that nature, right? It is much more a case of, okay, I've got my I've got my Rakdos Turbo, as I mentioned, like Canadian Highlander deck, right? My basically commanderless deck, and then at some point when things get crunchy, you get to go, okay, cool. Now I can play Commander, the format, because I have enough treasures, or I have enough of these extra treasures and resources and things like that, where I can go, cool, Shadow into thing you can't deal with, thing you can't deal with, thing you can't deal with, game over, right? And that's where the deck starts to become really, really interesting, right? And starts to do some pretty busted stuff, right? And that's I think one of the reasons I think this deck is real is because of that notion, right? I don't think Rakdos decks outside of this list have a very good mid game. I think a lot of them struggle to, even if they're a deck like Ob, right, which I've seen have like 10, 15, 20 cards in hand, or well, I guess in exile, right, through Ob, but still like struggle to actually push through those windows. That is where Shadow does come in and get to like get you a decent amount of advantage, is this ability for it to basically go like, all right, cool. As soon as I stick, crack a treasure, play something busted, literally nothing can be done about it. There was a situation in that game I was talking about where I pushed through 2 Rhystic Studies, where one of my opponents was sitting there on a 1-ring activation, and the other opponent looked at them and goes, hey, can you activate the 1-ring right now so we can see if we can do anything? And they looked back and they're like, I literally haven't even had priority because of these split-second spells. Like there's been no literal window where I can even put this 1-ring activation on the stack to potentially even find an answer because of the way that the split-second ability works, right? Which is pretty crazy. And, you know, the idea that like cards like Pyramid Abyss haven't been played as much, right? But when they have split second, it doesn't matter that your opponents could have a deflecting swat or a misdirection or a bowmasters because they just literally can't play it, right? But with all of these upsides being mentioned, we also have to recognize the downsides of the deck, which is effectively you're playing with completely no, I mean, not completely, but basically no card advantage in the command zone, right? And you're basically playing in a deck where you have to pick and choose your windows correctly, right? I built this deck for some Scribe Babies recordings, and definitely was one of those things where I like lent it out to people to play, and it was a lot more complicated for them to like get through all of the lines with it, because they do get so crunchy and so messy, and you have to have your turbo brain really, really locked in, but also be ready to then play the, okay, how do I not mess up the turbo plan in a mid-range game type of stuff. And there's a lot of stuff going on for that process. Now, is it like the most insanely 7D chess deck in the world? No, absolutely not. But to play it for its best, it's in its best function, it definitely shouldn't just be like I play Shadow when I have 4 mana and then try and do some random stuff mode, right? It should be much more the case of, okay, here is my deck, and I know Shadow's the late game, basically silver bullet, but in the meantime, let me get my Rakdos Turbo Brain like locked in. How do I do that part of my game plan effectively, right? But that being said, was able to win in 4th seat for both of my wins during Swiss, which is pretty good for a Rakdos deck, right? Like usually being in 4th seat sounds like a death sentence, right? But I was able to win 2 games in a row from 4th seat in games where we went to turn 6, turn 7 because of all of these giant, crazy mid-range battles, right? So definitely super interesting to see from that capacity. I sat down in one pod and they were like, oh yeah, ready for the turbo plan. And I was like, kinda. I was like, that's not really when I've been winning, but yeah, that is, I guess you could be ready for that, sure, right? Like, and of course, that's the game where I like draw the Goblin Welder hand, right? It looks crazy fast at that point, but I was like, this is the fastest this deck's even come close to performing, right? But all of that being said, the deck is super fun to play. I ended up going, it was a 4-round cut to top 10. So I went 2-0 in the first 2 rounds of Swiss. We lost to the Blue Farm player who ended up winning the entire tournament. Then round 4 of Swiss, I was in a situation where basically a Kenrith player had a Pact of Negation, and they basically had to choose between letting a Godo player who had a win on the stack win, or letting me get to my turn with basically Breach, LED, Shadow out, and like 3 draws from a 1 ring, right? So we basically just called it a draw at that point in Swiss. So those games were all felt really good. I ended Swiss with the second best record, right? So because it's a top 10 cut, the bottom 8 play it out for the last 2 spots in the finals, and the top 2 players in Swiss go to the finals. I had the second best record in Swiss, so I went right to the finals from that capacity. So then we went to the finals, and it was the game that I sort of described earlier, which is, I was doing, well, the finals was a little crazy because I mulled to 4 and everyone else kept 7s, including 2 Blue Farm decks. So I wasn't feeling super great about my prospects, to be honest, even from that point. But then I basically lost my Grim Hireling somewhat early. Blue Farm in 3rd seat tapped out for an Adnaz. The Blue Farm in 1st seat flared that Adnaz, and basically the game ended from that point. So, and that was only like turn 3. So, that's sometimes games go like that, and there's not much a deck like Shadow can really do in those situations. You kind of need to have the ability to untap and like press the advantage a little bit more to be able to fight those off. And it's where that deck's going to have a disadvantage going against decks like Blue Farm, right? And if one of the 2 blue players in the bod taps out for a Naz, there's not much we can do to deal with the other player who gets to copy the Naz and then counter that other ad nauseum, right? So it is what it is. But yeah, the point being, the deck felt pretty solid, honestly. I was pleasantly surprised by it. It's definitely a deck I would play again because it's very fun right now to just be playing faster decks in the format. As I mentioned, like, faster is a little bit of a nuanced term when it comes to this deck, because it's not exactly like turbo, right? It has turbo aspects to it, but as I mentioned, like your win cons cost 6, 7, and 8 respectively, right? So like there are going to be times when you can cheat them in super early and do the Rakdos thing, and it's super sweet when that happens. But there are also other times when you're like, hey, let's play my grind engines and play my Grim Hirelings and my Revs and my Face Breakers and all of those things. And I'm going to beat people up and make a bunch of treasures, and then find windows of opportunity to basically get a Shadow in because you've got like 13 mana and then just go, cool, uncounterable spell, GG's, right? That's where the deck tends to thrive. I feel like the best use of our time now, maybe get some mulligans in. I think that'd be really good. Okay, so whenever I simulate mulligans, I'll start in first seat and then we'll move back in turn order as time goes on. Right here, we have a 2-land Faithless Looting opener. I think these Faithless Looting gets very overestimated as far as decks like this are concerned, as far as like whether it makes a hand even slightly keepable. Faithless Looting is technically card disadvantage, right? Because you're drawing 2 and discarding 2, right? And you used a spell to get to that point. So despite the cards going up 2, down 2, you're still using a spell, therefore starting at disadvantage there. Now, if I had some sort of, like, for example, Bolsa Citadel in the deck, right? Duretti would be there to reanimate it somewhat early in the game, and I'd be a little bit more incentivized to look at keeping a hand like this. But I don't have anything I really am trying to entomb in this hand, and then I don't have a creature to turn on Springleaf Drum early. It's looking a little clunky, so we're going to shift that away. And I will say, I think mulligans with this deck are somewhat difficult because you don't have a commander effectively to help with mulligans whatsoever, right? It is really just a case of we are doing our best with the cards we have in hand, and then we need to sort of make a game plan from that, right? As I mentioned, Shadow is a late game tool, not an early game tool. Sensei's Top turn 1, Arcane Signet into activating Sensei's Top turn 2 is just way too slow for this format, right? Like you're really just basically showing your opponents a lot of disrespect if you're basically going, no worries, we don't need to take a relevant game action until like turn 4. It's not going to work out with a hand like this, so we'll go to 6 here. Okay. There's a lot of acceleration, but not a whole ton to do with it, weirdly enough, right? So we have I guess you could play Greedy Freebooter kind of early on in the game. We have a lot of the right ingredients to a recipe that isn't there, it feels like a little bit. Freebooter probably can go. And funny enough, like I'm kind of looking at playing this Duretti on turn 2 as my main game plan here, because right now we have Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond. Now it is worth noting that this isn't like a Breach LED Brain Freeze deck because we don't have access to Brain Freeze, right? So despite Breach and Lion's Eye Diamond being good, we still need some sort of payoff for having those cards in our hand, right? So that's why I'm kind of looking at Duretti here as the only thing that technically gives us any sort of advantage as far as cards are concerned, right? So getting a turn 2 Duretti down means that we could potentially start rummaging some cards away, setting ourselves up for maybe even as early as a turn 3 Breach win, which would be pretty cool. But that all being said, probably tuck this Greedy Freebooter at the bottom because we don't need it for the lack of sacrifice effects in our hand. Turn 1, we could probably play like... actually, we want to keep the Lion's Eye Diamond in hand because it's actually a pretty relatively free card to put in the graveyard if we need to pitch something for Duretti. And so we keep this hand. Turn 1, depending on our draw, probably just play a tap land and past. There's a world in which you want to play a Surveil land in this deck. I'm a big not Surveil land guy, but I did actually have a Surveil land in the earlier version of this deck, but just couldn't find it the day of the tournament, so then I didn't include it. You could play it, you could not play it. I think you don't need it, and I would argue that it's probably going to ruin more hands than it will keep you good ones. But all that being said, still play the Shatter Skull smashing tapped on turn 1 seems perfectly reasonable. Or if you want to play the Verdant Catacombs, get that fetch out of the way in case you're worried about things like Oppo, that's also reasonable as well. And try to set up this turn 3 Breach, hopefully for a win, which would be pretty cool. All right, going to seat 2, hand number 1. Okay, this one's pretty interesting. So, honestly, the biggest downside of this hand is that it looks probably better than it actually is. I think, you look at this hand in a deck like Blue Farm and it's like, cool, GG's, you're all cooked, right? But like, as I mentioned, this is a fair Necro deck, right? This is a deck where, you being Rakdos, you only have a limited amount of tools in the tool belt, right? I would have a hard time throwing this hand away, to be clear about that, but it would definitely be one of those hands that I'd be worried makes me look scarier than I am capable of being, sadly enough. I still think like you can do some pretty crazy stuff turn 3, especially if you maybe push your Necropotence luck a little bit and see what comes off of that. So I think you keep it no matter what, with the idea being turn 1, you probably go and fetch a Badlands off the Verdant Catacombs. You probably could put your Necromancy under the Chrome Mox because it's a good effect in the deck, but when it comes to that or not playing Wishclaw turn 1 and not playing Necropotence turn 2, notably you can't put Deflecting Swat under there and get that turn 2 Necro down, right? Because you need a black pip. So realistically speaking, the best play pattern is to go Badlands, put the Necromancy under, Wishclaw turn 1. Obviously, if you draw something that's nice to drop, then we'll adapt accordingly. But this is just, whenever you're sculpting a plan from your opening hand, we can't play around whatever the blind draw from 92 remaining cards is going to be, right? We got to play around what we have available to us. So Wishclaw turn 1, Necro turn 2. It's a good amount of resources. Necro can fill us up to 7. And if honestly either of these get countered, that's fine, because as long as one of them sticks, you're in a good position, which I think is a big benefit of keeping the hand too. So going into seat 3 here, we have a hand that's obviously these 2 lands, this Ragavan, LED, Diabolic Intent, Purity Abyss, and this Flare. So this is really only a hand, seeing as we're seat 3. It's really, really slow. And what I effectively can glean out of this hand is, yeah, you could basically come up with a whole line about like Diabolic Intenting your Ragavan on turn 2 to look for a breach, but we don't have any of the resources to actually convert that to a win here. The only time I'd ever really consider looking at a line like this is if I'm in a scenario in which I'm playing against like 3 hard Turbo Naz decks, and I think basically I could get away with Flare of duplicating someone's Turbo Naz. They're ad nauseum, to be clear. Apart from that, though, and very realistically speaking, I would have a hard time keeping a hand like this as our first 7 in seat 3, because while it has a lot of nice stuff, it just doesn't have enough things to really get things going. Second 7, we are looking at, okay, this one's pretty interesting here, right? So we can get this Ragavan down turn 1, and then sadly we're a little short. If we hit a land drop in the first 2 turns, we can basically get that turn 2 One Ring or turn 2 Grim Hireling down to support the Ragavan, which would be pretty cool here, right? But it's hard to call this hand anything but what it is, which would be very greedy, right? I guess you could offer the argument that worst case scenario, you Wheel of Fortune on turn 2, but I can't stress enough how a wheel is not a game plan, and especially with wheels in particular, one of the things you want to be thinking about when you're gaining advantage through wheels is that you're using permanent mana sources to develop past a wheel, right? An early wheel is much better when you have resources coming out of that wheel more than your opponents. Now, right now, what we're looking at is we would have to throw away our Simian and our Lotus Petal and be stuck on 1 land pre-wheel, which is obviously not a great setup. Plus, this is hypothetically seat 3 on turn 2, and our opponents would have a lot of development having already happened. Some of them might have dumped basically the entirety of their hand at this point. So just jamming a wheel into that pod, not to mention the fact that it might get countered on turn 2, very unlikely to pay off. So yes, while the Grim Hireling thing and all that kind of stuff can be tempting, I think this hand is ultimately more greedy than it's worth. So I'd go to 6 here. This 6 is just not it. This is a bunch of pieces from different parts of the deck. It's a trap hand through and through. 2 mana sources, a Burnt Offering that's effectively a dead card. Citadel and Aetherflux are basically dead cards. Twin Flame isn't doing anything. Yep, these are all the one of pieces in the deck that unfortunately don't work with each other. Okay, now we are down to 5, and it's a no-lander. This happens sometimes. All right, going down to 4. Now, while we are looking at a no-lander, it's not technically the worst no-lander that I've ever seen. Here, we're basically looking at a situation where we can basically choose an advantage piece in our hand and keep that, and then keep all of this acceleration is probably the game plan I would go with. Now, we're at 4. This would be better at any other higher hand size, but the idea here for me would be to take all the fast mana and you take Ragavan here. Now, Ragavan is sometimes card advantage, right? Which is something that's kind of important to know. I don't often like to keep hands around it unless, for example, like in this situation here, I'm desperate, which you can definitely argue that I am mulling to 4 without anything to pay off and technically no lands here, right? If I can wait for any spell to allow me to go Chrome Mox, Soul Ring, Arcane into Ragavan, then I'm going to wait for that, right? Because I don't really want to imprint the Chrome Mox for the Ragavan unless whatever I draw off the top is a good payoff here, right? So basically, if I get any colored spell I'm willing to throw away, I'll throw it into the Chrome Mox. But if it's something like a Demonic Tutor or a Wheel or a One Ring, etc., Ragavan's going to go into the Mox, which, you know, you do have a pretty good ability to more likely than not draw something that's a good payoff for having 4 mana next turn, right? So odds are pretty good that you can get something pretty attractive here. And finally, in 4th seat. Now, as many people know who have worked with me in the past, if you're in 4th seat, sometimes you got to get greedy. That's okay. So we have this hand here, which is very, very slow for 4th seat. You're basically not taking a relevant game action for a disturbing amount of time. So we'll definitely throw that one away. Okay, so we have a gemstones here. So this hand has some green flags, but it's got some big red flags, right? So green flags, this is a turn 1 professional facebreaker, which to me is a pretty green flag, I will say. The biggest red flag here is the fact that there's very minimal card advantage in this hand. While technically, yes, we do have card advantage in the form of this facebreaker, being able to exile the treasures that it gets off the top of your library. You basically need to make sure you're connecting with this facebreaker, and you need to make sure it is happening in a timely manner. Now, I think there's enough things going right for this hand that I'd be willing to, for example, exile away the Arid Mesa or the Mountain, and then just play that turn 1 facebreaker. And then worst case scenario, you kind of hope that like you don't need to play Shadow on turn 2, but you do have 2 natural draws off the top of your library. It's not my favorite hand going forth, but I would consider this like, you know, a classic C's get degrees kind of hand where like I'm not happy about keeping it, but I would if I had to. But as I said, I wouldn't be ecstatic about it either. It's definitely a hand that could I would prefer on like a 6, right? But that's it's just a tough hand with the cards we've been dealt, unfortunately. Because at 6, I'd probably just tuck this on half and exile one of the lands. But all that being said, as I said, would be at least willing to consider this hand, depending on how fast the pod is. Now, if the pod is really, really fast, and well, even then we still have like a Pyroblast, right? So like I guess a fast non-blue pod, I would probably have to throw this way. But let's just say those odds are lower for sure. So those were some mulligans with our Shadow the Hedgehog deck here in cEDH. What do you all think of this list? I'm super curious to hear your thoughts on how Shadow is gonna be played. As I mentioned, it's not the deck that I would, take for my first cEDH adventure, but at the same time, like if you're playing with friends at a local game store, like it's still a fun deck to learn on because at the end of the day, you're trying to do your game plan, right? And you're really trying to focus on your plan. But I think mastering this deck is a bit of a tougher thing. I think it's a lot more of the cases of really understanding what it means to have a window in cEDH and all of those things. And especially when it comes to the Rakdos Breach style winning the game lines, they're good, but they're very hard to quantify and they're not exactly the easiest to execute, right? So it's something that, I've played a lot of Storm decks in this format, so it's something that I can sort of pick up and just go with, right? But I think a lot of folks who are maybe newer to the format might struggle with that part of the deck most of all, right? The basically, how do I not mess up the Bolas' Citadel? How do I not mess up the Peer into the Abyss? How do I not mess up a Grinding Station, Underworld Breach line? Those are going to be the toughest ways for the deck to be played correctly, right? Because when it comes to things like Grinding Station, when it comes to things like Culling the Weak Stitcher Supplier, it's very easy to open yourself up to windows where your opponents might not have had them earlier in your turns, right? So that is definitely the biggest downside of the deck. And then obviously like not having blue interaction is also very real too, right? But there are ways around that specific part of the deck, not fully to where it's like trivial to do so, right? But you can definitely interact in meaningful ways with this deck too. So I had a ton of fun playing this deck. I'm definitely curious to hear what y'all think about it. Any cards that are in there or are not in there that y'all are thinking. I know at some point someone's going to mention Ad Nauseam, and I think I talked about it earlier in this video, but I'll just go highlight the mana value of our deck right now, which is about 1.6 as the reason we are not doing that. There's also some spicy cards on the sideboard that were definitely in earlier versions of the deck and whatnot, and I know I'm probably going to get a bunch of questions about those as well. But the deck was a ton of fun to pilot. It is definitely not one that will not be sleeved up again for me. I'll definitely play it again at some point because as I said, it sort of surprised me with how viable it actually felt to play this deck in the format right now. So thank you all for watching this video, and we'll be zooming into the next one soon and talk about some Spider-Man stuff coming up with some other very cool proactive decks that I'm very excited about moving forward. Thank you all, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.